Chapter 6. A Day at Home. The next morning, Joseph did the milking quickly and brought the pail in the house. He covered it with the cloth to let it cool and give the cream time to rise to the top. His mother placed a platter of fried cornmeal mush and maple syrup and another of thickly sliced fried ham on the table for breakfast. Clay clumped downstairs. He yawned and stretched as he sat down for breakfast. Mr. Byers took a bite. "Delicious," he announced. "Fit for a king." Joseph's mother looked pleased at the compliment. "I need to do some washing today," she said, "but later I might go shopping. We're out of sugar, and I need 50 cents to pay for the shoes I had repaired." Mr. Byers handed her several silver dollars. "Why don't you let me hire Mrs. Douglas to do the washing for you?" Mrs. Byers shook her head. "I don't mind doing it, and with things slow at your factory, it doesn't seem right. Everything's so expensive these days. If a war comes, things will be even more expensive," Mr. Byers remarked. "Do you really think there'll be a war?" asked Mrs. Byers. Joseph had been only half listening to the conversation, but at the word war he looked up. Mr. Byers was nodding. "Mr. Lincoln has already said he won't let the country be torn apart. Tempers are so high, it won't take much to start fighting. All this marching and singing going on." Mr. Byers shook his head. "Most folks are acting like it's a picnic instead of a war." "I don't think I would have voted for Mr. Lincoln," said Mrs. Byers thoughtfully. "If the Southern states want to leave the Union, he should just let them." "Huh, fortunately for the country, women can't vote," he chuckled. "What do women know of government?" Mrs. Byers said nothing, but instead of singing the way she usually did when she did dishes, she rattled the pots and pans as she cleared the table, and Joseph knew she was unhappy. He thought his stepfather was wrong. His mother often helped him with his studies. She'd helped him memorize the Declaration of Independence, and she knew and she hadn't needed to look at a book. She already knew every word by heart. Mr. Byers looked at Joseph. "Clay is talking to Dr. Mercer today. You stay home and help your mother. If she doesn't need you, there are logs that need to be split for the stove." Joseph's shoulders drooped. He had planned to explore the cave. "I might leave work a little early," Mr. Byers said. "I hear there's going to be a small slave auction by the courthouse." Mrs. Byers looked worried. "Maybe, maybe you should just stay away," she said. "There's too many people upset with you already." "When people are upset, they're more likely to think," said Mr. Byers. "Maybe some of them will realize how truly evil it is for one man to own another." In an unusual display of affection, he kissed his wife's cheek. "Don't worry, I can take care of myself." Clay, looking handsome but uncomfortable in a new suit, left for his interview with Dr. Mercer. Joseph headed outside to start on the wood splitting. "Fetch me water for the clothes washing first, Joseph," Mrs. Byers said as he reached for the door. Joseph pumped several buckets of water. His mother heated a huge tubful on the stove while she sorted the clothes. First, she would wash the whites, scrubbing them on a ribbed washboard. Next, the colored things would be washed in the same water. Then Joseph would have to bring in more for the rinsing. After that, the tub would be filled once more, and his mother would boil the clothes, stirring them with a wooden paddle. When they were finished, she would hang the clothes outside to dry. It was a job that took her most of the day. While his mother worked, Joseph tackled the wood. The logs from a tree cut last spring had been seasoning near the barn. It was good hickory. Hickory logs were hard, which meant they burned for a long time. Their hardness also made them difficult to split. Joseph had to stand each log on its end and pound in a wedge to force them to crack. Joseph worked for several hours, making a satisfying pile of wood ready for the stove. After so long, his stomach was growling with hunger. As he walked to the house, he rubbed the palm of his hand where blisters had formed. The kitchen was humid from the washing. Mrs. Byers was lifting each piece of steaming hot clothing with a wooden paddle and putting it into another tub on the floor near the stove. Joseph knew she would let them cool long enough so that she could wring out the water before hanging them outside. I'm hungry, Joseph announced. Mrs. Byers left the clothes to cool and made a lunch. I don't like to leave Jared when he's feeling so sick, she said as she put lunch on a tray for Jared to eat in bed. I'd like you to do the errands for me. Joseph nodded happily. Here was his chance to look at the cave. The ground would be dry by now. He glanced at the clock in the parlor. He could make a quick visit to the cave and still have time to do his mother's errands. A brisk wind outside promised a return to winter weather. Joseph pulled his coat around him as he walked quickly to the river. The ground was dry enough for him to climb down the bank, even though the mudslide had made it steeper than before. The river had gone down to its normal depth, no more than waist high. Joseph could hardly believe it was the same river that had nearly drowned him a few days before. The entrance to the cave was narrow, but when he peeked inside, he could see a rather large cavern. He crawled through the entrance, wishing he had thought to bring a lantern. The top of the cavern was high enough that he could stand quite comfortably. Stepping carefully, he examined the area. It was the size of a small room. At one side, he noticed another opening. Maybe the whole hillside was a huge network of caverns. Feeling along cautiously, he stepped into the second passageway. But away from the outside entrance, it was impossible to see. He retraced his steps and squeezed out into the daylight. He would share his discovery with Zachary, he decided. They could return with ropes and lanterns and explore the rest of the cave. Excited at the idea, he looked at the opening. It would be visible to anyone coming down the river. He climbed up the bank and gathered enough brush to screen the cave. When he was done, he climbed down to the river and checked. If anyone looked carefully, he'd see the cave, but with the brush in place, no one would give it more than a passing glance. Dusting off the dirt from his clothes, he climbed back up the hill and hurried toward town. The shoe repair shop was tucked into a narrow alley behind the main street. He handed the proprietor 50 cents and waited while the man hunted for the right shoes among the piles on every shelf. Suddenly, he heard shouts from outside. He stepped to the door and peeked. Several young men were wearing the blue uniform of the Union Army, were, who were wearing the blue uniform of the Union Army, were backed up against the wall, facing an angry crowd of other young men. Joseph recognized several of them. They were troublemakers who generally hung around town drinking and fighting. One of them shook his fist at a soldier. Why don't you get on home, Yankee? We don't need you telling us what we can't do. I'm no Yankee. I come from Kentucky just like you, the soldier protested. But I don't think states can just break up the country anytime they feel like it. The cobbler tapped Joseph on the shoulder. Found them, he exclaimed. Joseph stepped back into the shop and waited impatiently while the cobbler tied the shoes together with string. Pay no attention to that outside, he said, jerking his head. There are fights like that almost every day now. Joseph nodded and stepped back out of the door. The men were brawling now, seemingly evenly matched. As Joseph watched, a Union officer astride a big black horse rode into the alley. He pulled his gun out of his side holster, and Joseph caught his breath. The officer merely fired in the air, and the men froze, wiping bloody noses with the backs of their hands. A second later, the local boys had run off, and the soldiers were stumbling out of the alley under the officer's watchful eye. Joseph's next errand was to purchase 2 pounds of sugar. He crossed the street, heading for the general store. The clock on the courthouse tower said 2. There was a small crowd gathered nearby. He remembered what his stepfather had said about a slave auction. Curious, he walked toward the crowd. Zachary was there, standing on the corner by himself. He spotted Joseph and waved. Leaving the sugar purchase for later, Joseph hurried to his friend. "Is this the slave auction?" Joseph asked. When Zachary nodded, Joseph grabbed his arm and pulled him toward some bushes growing at the side of the courthouse. Crouched behind, they had a good view. "Mr. Byers said he might come," Joseph whispered. "I don't want him to see me." Zachary stood up and peered over the crowd. About 30 people had gathered for the auction, but there was no sign of Mr. Byers. A platform had been raised behind the courthouse, and the crowd was gathered around it. A young, strong looking black man was on it. He stood quietly, eyes downward, while an auctioneer praised his abilities. "John here is a good blacksmith. You can hire him out, and he'll practically pay for himself." A man from the watching crowd climbed up onto the platform. He felt John's muscles, made him open his mouth, and looked at his teeth. $1,000, said the man as he climbed down. Joseph watched in shocked silence. Of course, he knew about slave auctions, but he'd never actually seen one. Had Pa bought his slaves in just such a way? Had he coldly looked at their teeth as if they were no more than horses? Still, he told himself, slaves were expensive. His father would have made sure the ones he bought were healthy. Next to the platform were 2 young girls. One was no more than 14. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she stood with her arms around a younger girl who was sobbing openly. "Their mother has already been sold," Zachary whispered. "The new owner didn't want the girls." "Well, that seems mean," Joseph remarked. Zachary looked at him and shrugged. "They're slaves. They don't feel things like we do." "Then why are they crying like that?" Joseph asked. The bidding for John stopped at 1,500, and the new owner, the one who had examined John's teeth, paid and led him away. The girls were then prodded until they climbed the platform, still clinging to each other. "Lily has had some training to be a housemaid. Miriam, her younger sister, is already a good seamstress. You can buy them both, or I'll sell them separate," said the auctioneer. Miriam sagged weakly against her sister. "Please, no," she begged. The crowd ignored her distress. Lily stood stiffly, awaiting her fate. Suddenly, Joseph saw a familiar figure. Mr. Byers strode up to the platform and faced the crowd. Several people booed when they saw him, but Joseph's stepfather stood firmly in front of them, his eyes blazing. "You should be ashamed of yourselves, all of you. These are human beings, and even worse, these 2 are children." Several men in the crowd jeered. "Mind your own business. Get 'em out of here." Someone picked up a rock and threw it. Joseph feared for his stepfather. He looked around for someone to help. A few people looked ashamed, but no one made a move. Hold it there, Henry, Sheriff Underwood said, stepping out of the crowd. Right or wrong, these people aren't breaking the law. If you don't leave, I'll have to arrest you. Mr. Byers allowed the sheriff to lead him away, but he called back a final challenge. How can you sleep at night and do this? Joseph did not wait to see the bidding begin again. He pushed his way out of the bushes and ran back down the street. Zachary caught up with him at the door of the general store. What's wrong? Zachary asked. Why did you run away like that? I've got to do some chores for my mother, Joseph answered. Zachary stared at him. I guess it was sad to watch, he admitted. But those girls will be all right when they get to their new homes. Would you? Joseph asked. Zachary squirmed uncomfortably. They're used to it. Joseph's mind whirled in confusion. How could everyone he knew be wrong? Zachary, his own father, the preacher, even his gentle mother believed that slavery was all right. Just about the only person who didn't approve happened to be the one person he didn't like. I have to admit that stepdaddy of yours is really something, Zachary said. I don't know if that man is foolish or brave, but he sure isn't afraid to say what he thinks. Joseph didn't answer. He thought about the way Mr. Byers had stood so fearlessly in front of the angry crowd. He had to admit Mr. Byers was very brave. Still, one man wasn't going to change anything. All his stepfather was doing was turning everyone in town against his whole family. I've got to get home, Zachary said, with a glance at the courthouse clock. Joseph watched his friend until he turned the corner, heading for the mill. Then he hurried to finish the errands for his mother. Clay was already home when he arrived. He was talking excitedly with his mother about his visit with Dr. Mercer. I'll have my own room in the attic, he said, and Dr. Mercer will let me go with him when he visits the sick. Of course, at first I'll only be able to stand and watch, he added. Mrs. Byers smiled at Joseph. Dinner will be a little late, she said. Mr. Byers isn't home yet. Before Joseph could decide if he should tell what he'd seen, Mr. Byers walked in. There was a small bruise under his eye. We don't need to worry about those slave catchers we saw yesterday, Mr. Byers said. Sheriff Underwood tells me their names are Bales and Scroggins. They're a pretty disreputable sort, but they left town this morning. Seems they found the runaway sleeping under a railway bridge. Joseph started to ask what would happen when the slave was returned. Then he decided he really didn't want to know and pushed the thought out of his mind. The slave shouldn't have run away, he told himself. Mr. Byers did not mention the confrontation on the courthouse lawn. He was quiet during dinner, and afterward went straight to his desk to work on accounts. Joseph read a story to Jared while their mother did some mending, and Clay studied for his Latin exam. It was an evening like any other. Outside, a cold wind was blowing, reminding them that winter was not yet over. Tomorrow would be a Sunday, like any other, and then Monday Joseph would have to return to school. Nothing in his world had changed, yet somehow nothing seemed quite the same.